Um,
What hard meeting?
Yes. She's so bright and so smart.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. You're welcome to the session. This is the Africa Governance Center, and we are super excited today to host the Global Affairs Forum. We are so blessed and privileged to have distinguished speakers to talk on the war in Iran. So before we start this program, I would like to once again welcome you, our distinguished panel. Thank you so much for making time to join us. We also privileged to have the executive director, as well as the executive chair of the Africa Governance Center with us. And so without much ado, I will call on Professor Nelson Opong, who is the executive director of the African Governance Center, to give us an opening remark so that we all know why we're here and why this gathering is important. So, Prof, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Annan, for the very kind opening and introduction. Distinguished panelists, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, greetings. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. On behalf of the Africa Governance Center, I'm pleased to welcome you to this session of our Global Affairs Forum, and thank you for engaging with issues that profoundly shape Africa's present and future. Today's forum examines how the ongoing US-Israel war with Iran is testing the stability of the international system. This is a timely and important conversation. The Africa Governance Center is a Pan-African think tank dedicated to advancing African-centered solutions to governance, security, and development challenges. Our work aims to strengthen governance systems, promote democratic values, support regional cooperation, and advance inclusive economic transformation across the continent. Our Global Affairs Forum is grounded in a simple reality, and that is Africa is not outside global geopolitics. Major conflicts and power shifts elsewhere are felt directly across African economies and societies, as we have seen, but often with serious and disproportionate consequences for the region. The war in the Middle East illustrates this clearly. Beyond its tragic humanitarian toll, the conflict continues to disrupt global energy markets, trade routes, and diplomatic relations. For many African countries, this means rising energy costs, food insecurity, fiscal strain, and renewed pressure on economies still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war. In this context, we strongly support the African Union's call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and for all parties to prioritize dialogue and diplomacy. At a time of heightened global tension, adherence to international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter is essential. But this moment also demands deeper reflection. What we are witnessing is not just another crisis, but part of a broader shift in the global order. Norms are under strain, alliances are shifting, and the rules of global engagement are being redefined. Yet, despite bearing significant indirect costs, Africa risks once again being marginalized in decisions that fundamentally affect its security, development, and strategic interests. Today's discussion therefore asks critical questions. How is the war on Iran reshaping global energy and security dynamics? What does it tell us about the resilience of the international system? And how can Africa assert itself as an active strategic actor rather than a passive recipient of global shocks? And we are honored to be joined by distinguished experts and speakers who will help us to explore these questions. I thank all our panelists and all the participants for joining us, and I look forward to a thoughtful and forward-looking discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that wonderful welcome address. I would also want to introduce Madam Benedicta Lassie. She is a lawyer and she is the executive chair of the Africa Governance Center. And so Madam Lassie will be giving her remarks as chair. And then after those, we would move into the panel to dissect what is going on and to understand what is going on in Iran. So Madam Benedicta, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahin, and thanks very much to Professor Nelson Opon. And also thanks to our distinguished speakers and panelists that have joined us today. And as well, thanks to all the attendees that have joined us in this forum. Ladies and gentlemen, we have gathered here this afternoon to begin a conversation on the global affairs of the continent, but also looking at it from the perspectives of Africa, not just as Africa sees it, but as Africa plays a role in it. We convene this session of the Global Affairs Forum at a moment when the international system appears increasingly unsettled. The conflict involving Iran has once again brought questions about war, energy security, diplomacy, and strategic power to the forefront of global affairs. But beneath the immediate crisis lies a deeper reality concerning the many of the assumptions that shape international order over the past several decades, which are beginning to show weakening. Strategic mistrust is also rising. Economic interdependence is becoming entangled with geopolitical competition. Trade, finance, technology, energy systems, and even supply chains are now inseparably from questions of power and influence. At the same time, crises no longer remain regional for very long. They quickly emerge to becoming international. And a conflict in one part of the world quickly becomes inflation elsewhere, fiscal pressures elsewhere, political anxiety elsewhere. And so global instability now travels with remarkable speed. And for Africa, this experience is disrupts supply chain flows across the continent. But Africa's relationship with the world is also changing. The continent is becoming increasingly central to the future of global growth, strategic minerals, industrial supply chains, energy transition, maritime trade, and demographic transformation. The future of the international system will be shaped in part by what happens in Africa. And that is the reality that requires African institutions to think more seriously about the world and Africa's place within it. That is one of the reasons why we established the Global Affairs Forum at the African Governance Center. We wanted to create a space for thoughtful engagement on the forces reshaping international politics, economics, governance, and strategic order, we wanted to create a platform through which Africa engages the wider world with seriousness, confidence, and intellectual independence. Going forward, this forum would bring together voices from different regions to reflect on major questions shaping our century: conflict, democratic governance, economic security, diplomacy, technological changes, institutional legitimacy, and the future of international cooperation itself. Because one of the dangers of this period is that societies become more inward-looking precisely when deeper engagement is becoming more necessary. No region can detach itself from the pressures shaping the modern world. The challenges confronting Africa increasingly confront the wider international system as well. Institutional trusts, economic inequality, political fragmentation, social pressures, and the growing difficulty to govern complex societies in uncertain times. In many respects, the central political question of this century may be whether states and institutions can maintain coherence in an age of acceleration and accelerating disruption. That is why conversations such as this matter. And at the Governance Center, what we foresee in the next couple of months and years as we evolve or implement the Global Affairs Forum is that we are looking to engage in different regions, having conversations on Africa, not just within Africa, but can we bring our key stakeholders and partners in the North Africa within the context of the US or Canada to engage on policy issues that are impacting the continent? Can we engage with our European partners in having conversations that impact on the continent and how the continent contributes towards the global development? Are we also engaging our partners in Asia and Eastern Europe to begin to analyze how the impact of the disruptions that we are seeing would impact the economies of Africa, and what development cooperation has to offer so far as cooperation to develop our individual regions are concerned. And so we bring to you the Global Affairs Forum with the hope that we would create a platform that enables shared ideas in ensuring that we have a common vision of what is growth, what is development, and what is prosperity for the continent. I thank you once again, and I look forward to a useful and engaging discussion from the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Executive Chair, for that incredible remark. We're so grateful to you for this forum and also to the entire team at the Africa Governance Center. At this point, I would also want to introduce my co-moderator, Aram Rodrika William Quay, who would be assisting with the moderation. We want to ensure that there's a smooth flow, and so just when there's any break in connection, Rodrika would take over. So thank you so much to Professor Nelson Opong and Benedicta for those incredible remarks. And I'll be moving to my panelists. Again, to our participants, this is a very important discussion we're having because it boils down to everyday life. Every single person on this globe has felt the impact of the war on Iran. And so but a lot of people are getting their information from social media and other sources. But as a center that wants to educate the public on what is actually happening, we have experts who have been in the field for years, decades, to help us understand what is happening with the conflict or the war, however you want to call it, in Iran. And maybe throughout this discussion, we'll know whether it's a conflict or a war or an excursion. So, Professor David Shinn, I'll start with you. Prof is a former ambassador. Prof is also a lecturer and an author. Prof has been in the international relations field for quite some time. Yes. Prof has been ambassador to several countries in Africa. He currently is at the Elliot School of International Affairs at George Washington University. So, Prof, we are going to be, first of all, getting your thoughts on all of this. Someone will say chaos, of course. War is chaos. All of this chaos. Basically, your thoughts on the drivers that has led to this escalation. A lot of people are talking about the breakdown in diplomacy and also the international rules and norms that we know. What do you make of this?
Sure, thank you for the question. Is everyone hearing me okay? Is the sound quality adequate? Okay.
Yeah.
Let me make one clarification at the outset so there's no misunderstanding. I'm speaking as an independent academic, even though I spent 37 years in the State Department in Washington. I do not speak for the U.S. government, and I left quite a number of years ago, and I have no direct connection with the government. In terms of the strategic drivers that are sort of pushing this war ahead or have instigated the war, let me start with Israel, which I would argue the most important strategic driver was the long-standing desire to destroy Iran's ability to ever again pose a potential military threat to Israel. And Israel particularly wanted the destruction of any nuclear weapon capability in Iran. Now, for the United States, the strategic driver was similar, but from the beginning of the conflict, its goal or end game has not been clear. The U.S. obviously timed the war in careful coordination with Israel, which suggests that actually was one of the drivers. From a tactical military perspective, Israel and the United States were highly successful in destroying most of Iran's war-making capability. But to this day, the United States has not precisely identified the end game. Was it regime change? If so, that has not been achieved. Many former leaders are gone, but the regime itself remains in place with the hardline Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in an even stronger position than before. The attacks also may have disincentivized Iranian dissidents inside the country, and we know there were significant numbers of them, from attempting to change the regime. Was the driver the ending of Iran's control over affiliated organizations such as Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen? If so, recent Hezbollah attacks on Israel and a strong Israeli response suggest that this goal has not been achieved either. The Houthis, on the other hand, have been surprisingly quiet since the beginning of Operation Epic Fury. Nor has the attack ended Iran's ability to activate individual terrorist actions against perceived enemies in many parts of the world. And we know there has been a history of that kind of action in the past. Was the driver to end the ability of Iran to develop a nuclear weapon? Well, while the US and Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear facilities in June of 2025 destroyed much of the stability in Operation Midnight Hammer, it did not end the threat of Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon. Iran retained, after Midnight Hammer, an estimated 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. It is generally agreed that Operation Epic Fury did not recover this material. The International Atomic Energy Agency estimates that Iran's uranium stockpile, if further enriched, could result in the construction of 10 bombs. There seems to be agreement that Iran could produce enough weapons-grade uranium to build a nuclear weapon in 9 to 12 months. Finally, the Gulf of Hormuz was open before Operation Epic Fury. It is now closed as a result of actions taken primarily by Iran. Its reopening has now become an additional global strategic driver, and this is the one that has probably the most impact for African countries. Let me say a few words about regional security realignments as a result of what has happened so far. The conflict has reshuffled regional security dynamics. Are you still hearing me okay? It has pushed Iran closer to Russia and China. While Russia has shown some willingness to help Iran, China has been more circumspect. In fact, the conflict has demonstrated the limits of China's ability to play a constructive role, although this could change if China convinces Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, presumably in exchange for a resumption of oil shipments to China, which are significant from Iran. Iranian drone and missile strikes on numerous Arab countries, especially the United Arab Emirates, have severely strained relations with them. The Iranian attacks on Arab neighbors appear to have ended its détente with Saudi Arabia, brokered by China in 2023. They may also have pushed a number of Arab countries to seek a closer security relationship with the United States. Going forward, the war against Iran raises the question whether the Gulf states, especially the United Arab Emirates, will be able to play such an important political role, especially in the Horn of Africa, where they have been very active. The Gulf states are learning that their ability to influence events may be limited by their economic and security vulnerabilities. It also raises the question whether the Gulf states will continue to invest so heavily throughout Africa as they have in the past. There may be a decrease in Gulf state investment. Although Israel demonstrated impressive military capability, its attacks on Iran likely contributed to its further isolation in the region. Pakistan appeared as an important mediator between Iran and the United States, somewhat to everyone's surprise. In addition to several Gulf countries, India has experienced the most economic damage due to the disruption of energy supplies. If the stalemate in reopening the Strait of Hormuz continues much longer, non-oil exporting African countries will be severely harmed due to higher inflation, shortage of fertilizer, fuel shortages, and possibly inadequate food supplies. And I'll stop there, and hopefully this has opened up some issues and questions for other members of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shinn. As stated by my moderator earlier, I'm the co-moderator, Rodrika William Kwao. And we appreciate you for your valuable insight into the geopolitical and security dimensions of the conflict. I'd want to gently, I'd want to kindly remind all participants to kindly put their questions into the chat box as they arise, because there'll be a Q&A session afterwards, of which all the questions will be addressed. Thank you, Professor Shinn. Thank you, Professor Shinn. There have been implications of the conflict for the global energy market, maritime security, and economic stability. And to this end, we are pleased to invite Dr. Pa Kwesi Wosipra, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Lingnan University, to help us examine this dimension further. Dr. Pa, please, you're welcome to take the floor.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I will try to make my submission a little brief. I think on the spectrum of energy, on the impact on energy markets, I think the major damage or the major issue has to do with price and supply volatility. Now, in January 2026, oil price per barrel was around $60, but now has escalated over $100. That's a huge leap in prices. And this has a major effect on global energy markets. For the prices, it's a blessing for the suppliers. Higher prices means much profit for them. But as Professor Shinn said, for the non-oil producing countries, this is a serious burden for the non-oil producing countries. And I will bring it even much more down to Africa, which depends heavily on refined fuel, which by this I mean gasoline, jet fuel, from these Gulf countries. Africa depends on the Gulf countries for about 80 to 90% of oil. And with the cessation of oil flows, which is around 20 million barrels per day because of the blockade, African countries are suffering heavily because of this cessation of the flow of oil. And it's very important for us to also emphasize that many African countries have huge debt servicing burdens already on their hands to service. And therefore, these high prices of oil does not accrue any benefit to them. Most governments in Africa will be faced with two options: either to increase fuel prices, which then goes to affect every other areas of the economy, food, pharmaceuticals, everything, or government will have to subsidize, which also leads to higher costs for the government. And the danger is in Africa, this can lead to unrest and can even lead to violence because the burden on people is so high. So for the pricing, it's a challenge, but also a blessing for suppliers. But for the recipient, it's a major problem. Even Europe is suffering. Europe currently has its oil reserve at around 30%. However, they have more maybe structural capacity to deal with the shortage much better than countries in the global south. And I think on the maritime area of maritime, I think this challenges freedom of navigation to a large extent and has shown serious weakness in global maritime architecture. For Iran to be able to militarize or weaponize the Strait of Hormuz show that there is a major problem in global maritime industry. And one thing is also very important is, although our focus is on the Strait of Hormuz, where all major powers and even Middle and African states are looking at, but it also opens up a space in the Gulf of Aden for these pirates to navigate easily without much confrontation from the advanced powers, whose focus are currently on the Gulf, trying to ensure the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. So I think I'll put it in this context. Thank you very much. Please, can you hear me?
Thank you so much, Dr. Pakwesi, for that. It's very interesting that you talk about, the prices of oil. Of course, that is what everybody knows, but you also touch on very insightful stuff that, like the piracy issue that you used to catch the attention of some international stakeholders now have been lost, and all the attention is on the Straits of Hormuz and what that means for the rest of the world. And again, that doesn't mean that all these other dynamics have stopped or are not going on. So I'm glad you bring out these other things that are happening on the side. So I'll go to Professor Isaac Olewale Albert. And Prof is a professor of African history, peace and conflict studies at the Institute for Peace and Strategic Studies at the University of Ibadan. Prof, I'm very interested in what you will be talking about because, I'm also a security person, and that is, my area. I'm very interested in knowing, and I'm sure most of the panel would want to know, what this means for the international institutions that we have, the existing global order. Many have called to question the ability or the capacity of the United Nations in particular, because the United Nations has one singular mandate, and that is to prevent future world wars. And even for the fact that the rest of the world, everyone is on the edge, thinking that a third world war is imminent. That alone speaks to or gives justification to question whether or not our UN, as it is fit for purpose. Generally, I want to hear your insights and your thoughts on this war with Iran. And then if you could also zoom in and then just capture what this means for the United Nations and whether we are exaggerating or not looking at this in the right context. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to have you here, Prof.
Well, thank you so much, Africa Governance Center. And I also want to thank Professor Okpong and Madame Lassie for the efforts put into organizing today's meeting and also establishing this very, very important center. I listened very carefully to my senior colleague, Professor Shinn, and I also thank the immediate last speaker for his contributions to this discourse. We need to ask ourselves a number of questions. But before asking these questions, we need to underscore the fact that the issue we are discussing today is very significant because of the strategic involvement of America in this conflict or war. We are not too sure whether to define it as a conflict, whether to define it as a war. But America's involvement actually made it to be very topical. If we regard it as a war, the question we need to ask ourselves is, what were the objectives that America set for itself in getting involved in this conflict alongside Israel. The next question is, have we achieved these objectives? And I think the answer one will provide here is America has not been able to achieve these objectives. But what we have now is what one regard to as unsavory blowback. The entire world is negatively affected by this conflict, and it seems we are going to increasingly find it difficult to get beyond where we are. So we're entering a new world in which I would say we are returning to the old era of gunboat diplomacy. Gunboat diplomacy is antithetical to the spirit within which the United Nations was established. The United Nations will not want to see a world in which each country will defend itself, and therefore we sat down together to establish a global framework that will protect everybody based on the principle of collective security, subsidiarity, complementarity. That is the framework upon which the United Nations was established. But when you do a clinical analysis of what is happening in Iran today, and before it, you will see very clearly that we are returning to the era of unilateralism. We are moving away from multilateral politics to unilateral politics. Unilateral politics of which each country will have to come out to defend itself. But in the process of each country coming out to defend itself, we will realize that the global community is fragmenting. And a fragmental global community is actually not the one that will help us to have a more peaceful world. So, when we take a critical look at what is happening now, we will see that the United Nations, sorry, this might look like a strong language. The United Nations is no longer fit for purpose. It's no longer fit for purpose in the sense that it is an organization that is no longer able to facilitate collective global security. And I think this started basically because, one, it was difficult for us to actually have a situation where the Western world, Russia and China, will be able to have a consensus over how the global community will become more peaceful. But now we are entering a more dangerous dimension of the problem, with President Trump's America First. America First speaks to nationalism. And of course, in international diplomacy, all of us actually articulate or represent the spirit of America First. In international diplomacy, what we all do is to protect the best of our international interest. But I think the world is a little bit worried that America, that all of us look onto, that we have accepted as the leader of the world. Let us not deceive ourselves. America rules the world. Is withdrawing from the rest of the world. And this is creating gaps, lacuna, that will make it very difficult for the United Nations to be able to play the role for which it was established. Today, the United Nations is a shell of its former self because of the withdrawal of America from many of its institutions. Now, the war in Iran, to me, is an excessive expression of America first. Because when we come to international diplomacy, when we come to warfare, America galvanized the entire world in such a way that when America moves in a direction, and often democratic, the Western world will actually come on the side of America. But I think that spirit is increasingly breaking down. It's increasingly breaking down. Now, in Iran, what seems to be coming out now is that America went to Iran without actually galvanizing the support of the Western world, without actually having the full support of NATO, without actually getting many of the allied nations behind it. And the United Nations has not actually been able to help the matter. Just as Professor Albert sits down in Ibadan, Nigeria, University of Ibadan, watching the unfolding events, I think the UN too is watching the unfolding events, unable to actually come up with any framework that would enable us to deal with the problems in Iran. So what we are witnessing now is that global consensus is breaking down, and it is breaking down very, very fast. Because when the crisis in Iran were unfolding, I actually expected the European Union, I expected NATO and a few other great powers in the world to come in. But when you look at the framework within which NATO, for example, was established, the framework was that when any part of the world is endangered, and to the extent that it would affect the interest of the member state of NATO, that NATO will come in. And I think NATO could not come in. Many European nations could not come in because the war objectives in Iran was not collectively defined. It was not collectively framed. The nations were not consulted. And so, when the war started, each of these nations had to take into critical consideration their strategic national interest, and which seems to be antithetical to the war in Iran. And so they refused to intervene, and I think that strengthened Iran. I was doing the analysis of this conflict with some people 2 days ago, and they say, oh, Iran is a very powerful nation. And I said, no, Iran seems to be a powerful nation because those who should be part of that conflict are not there. And to me, they are not there for justifiable reasons. They are not there because it is not their war. They regard it as a war that is defined. I wouldn't say that war is defined by America. That war is defined by the current leadership of America. And it has therefore been very difficult for us to have a united front for confronting this problem. Now, the question you ask me has to do with the fate of the United Nations. The truth, which students of international relations must be taught, is that without America, it is difficult for the United Nations to fulfill its mandate. For now, America is withdrawn from the UN, not only politically, but also financially, making the United Nations to be a shell of its former self. And I think this is where we are today. And that questions where the rest of the world should be. It questions where Africa should be. As the two speakers rightly said, this crisis is affecting the entire world. In Nigeria, sectarian violence has been incentivized to the extent that the American embassy today is literally shut down. The embassy is afraid that there could be a proxy attack. We have the Shiites in Nigeria that are constantly on the streets, staging protests. There is scarcity of fuel. Fuel is very expensive in the country now. Across the world, people are lining up at fuel stations to buy, looking for fuel as a result of a conflict they did not start. So the question now is, who is going to bring all of us in the world together to address this problem and its matters arising? Let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Albert. This was truly insightful. Yes. Before we get to the final round, we want to know what these developments mean for Africa, particularly in relation to economic resilience, strategic positioning, and engagement with global partners. To address this critical African dimension of the discussion, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Victor Doke, who is a research fellow and lecturer at Kofi Annan Peacekeeping Training Center. Dr. Doke, you're invited to proceed.
Thank you very much, and good day to you.
Good day to you.
Business, and then compliments to Professor Shinn, and then Professor Olawale, and then Dr. Pra for setting the tone with regards to this all-important discussion. And kudos to the organizers also and partners for putting this together at this critical time when, as rightly said, the uncertainty with regards to this particular crisis is affecting all of us. Geopolitically, we are reeling the effects of this uncertain crisis. And for me, I was very honored to accept the invitation to speak because having had the opportunity to engage in discussions with other, think tanks and centers with regards to peace and security, looking at the dimension this has on Africa, especially because then at the end of the day, I, in my opinion, think that the crisis or geopolitical crisis has enormous effects for us than any other. Now, let me go straight with regards to talking about the economic resilience. And as my co-panelists have, highlighted mainly, I'll just add a few of those things. First of all, how is our economic resilience, right? The first question with regards to withstanding global shocks such as this, as we are seeing, where energy prices have skyrocketed. And when energy prices skyrocket, it means it has a direct link with inflation because you're talking about the unavailability of products, fuel, accompaniments with regards to, gas, and then other services. Now, it means these unavailability would affect transportation systems, would affect distribution of food, would affect, in and out with regards to human resource, how people can get to work and all that. And by and large, things become expensive. And when products or things become expensive, the people agitate. And when they agitate, then the insecurity sets in and you have threats of armed elements, criminal elements taking advantage of those, situations. Because we've seen and experienced how even without global shocks that have come in related to crisis or related to happenings of internal governments have resulted to the youths going on the streets, demonstrating over high taxes, over high products, basic needs that has, increased over time, and that has resulted in unconstitutional changes of government. So when we talk about this particular crisis and relating it to our economic resilience, how would we become resilient against such crisis in the future and not just today? So I look at a long-term aspect. We had a very beautiful discussion or argument in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, to date, how vibrant is that framework to the extent that we would be able to hit our hands on our chest and say we are confident that with any kind of crisis in the future, we can withstand the shocks, and Africa would be able to stand in terms of the economy. We haven't been able to get there. The challenges, bottlenecks, bureaucratic challenges, the political will, which is not there to see this very wonderful framework through, has been questioned. And that is what we need to look at when we talk about economic resilience. So for now, in the context of Ghana, we were enjoying reduced fuel prices, gas reduced, and that translated into the transportation system. Food prices was very low. Immediately the crisis erupted, we saw how increment in oil prices affected fuel prices also. And then likely we're going to see increment in transportation fares. Only that responsible governments would now be willing to take up the excesses and then shoulder the extra costs. If they are not able to do that, then we are talking about high cost of living, which would affect the ordinary citizens, and then it will lead to agitations. Now, you're looking at the aspect of uneven effects, oil exporters versus the importers. So for the potential short-term winners, okay, who are those exporters, such as Libya, Algeria, Nigeria, Angola, and the rest, who are or may benefit from the higher global energy crisis. Then you can also talk about the increased European demand for non-Gulf suppliers. So when we look at all these things, the gains may be temporary. Now, if global demand weakens, then you'll be sure that your gains will be what? Temporary. You wouldn't yield much. You're talking about shipping cost rise, the aspect of revenues that are not translated into structural investments. And so holistically, in the long term, there may be major losses. Now let's look at the aspect of food security and supply chains, which will be also one of the implications. Now, we know of countries that are heavily reliant on products such as fertilizers, oil products, which are not in supply. So it means the hold up with regards to shippings not being able to access the Strait of Hormuz to their various destinations means these products will be in short supply or non-existent. And what happens is it affects our production when it comes to food. And so your food security and associated supply chains will be affected. So what do we do with regards to positioning ourselves strategically in all of this crisis, strategic positioning for Africa is key. And what I see or observed is for African states, it is more of like the non-alignment strategy or focus. So the crisis has reinforced the return of great power competition, which is evident, where countries such as Russia, China are competing with regards to hegemonic representation or hegemonic aspects, and that of Israel and the US. And then you have the Gulf states, the EU states, and others also having to find their way with regards to who to align with in this kind of situation. So who are we comfortable to align with? And do we agree to be non-aligned as a continent overall? And this is fascinating because for my center, the KIPTC, will be having our 15th graduation ceremony in June 26th. And the theme is looking at the aspect of non-alignment and its implications in the context of peace and security. Now, countries such as the US, China, Gulf states, Russia, Turkey, and other emerging middle powers have shown with regards to their various opinions in this particular crisis. So are we just looking at what will benefit us in the end if we should align? If we should not align, then what are the consequences? What are the benefits? But overall, I'm looking at how aligning fully with one block, okay, as a continent would look like, and then the strategic non-alignment. So we are looking at, if you align, then you are sure to, of course, get some benefits in the trade, economic, political, and security-wise. But if not, then we are looking at how you sort of like fight for your own. And as Prof. Olawale said, the nationalistic tendency sets in here. And I tie the nationalistic or nationalism tendencies to realist thinking, because you're looking at the fact that we are in a space where there's no central authority to check us. And the UN has been linked with regards to being incapable of resolving or addressing these kind of global crises we are facing. So then, for some nations, the self-interest or nationalistic tendencies are more of what we are seeing, and they will go all out with regards to satisfying that goal when it comes to their sovereignty and national interest. Cooperating in the economic aspect with the multiple powers, if you should align, is possible. Now, on the opposite, if you're not able to align or you're not aligned, then it means cooperating economically becomes a challenge. And that is why, for me, I'm looking at the aspect where the continent will be able to be economic resilient. And so that if we choose to be non-aligned, we know we have a very resilient system framework that can withhold every shock. And so we wouldn't even mind for any reason to be aligned. Let's look at the growing importance for African energy and how the European states or EU, or better yet, Europe, seeks to diversify, the Middle Eastern supply routes and now focus on the African energy resources, which has become very strategic and more important. And that can also be linked to our strategic positioning of how we should have bilateral or multilateral relationships when it comes to the aspect of trade and economy. So you're talking about gas projects all over Africa, the aspect of oil and gas in quantities that can supply and make or position us strategically to be able to trade. And that also offers us the opportunity to be included on a global table when we're discussing issues about the economy, the trade, peace, and security. Then engagement with global partners. How would our relations look like in the face of this crisis with regards to the countries that are directly involved in this crisis or indirectly involved with this crisis? So we are looking at how we have now been very comfortable engaging with every country on the continent. Specifically, let me mention China, which has a growing influence on Africa, Russia in that space also, looking at the areas of trade, energy, and then security. How does this pan out in the future? So it means for there's a shift. Looking at how the shift has moved from Western phase kind of global partners to this new phase. Okay, we're looking at the Asias and then partners from the Baltic areas. It is very essential that we understand that for the long term, the resource security strategy, when you look at Africa's contribution, would be a factor in engagement with global partners, which would benefit us if we know the right discussions to table out when we're talking about the fair share or distribution pattern. What would our relationship look like with countries like the United States and EU? I mean, your guess is as good as mine. In the context of global partners, then it means we as a continent to be sort of like careful how we deal with these partners. And as much as we want to grow our economy with our resources, it would be very essential that we take into consideration the areas we would likely focus our priority areas and the areas we wouldn't want to prioritize, and then see how best we would have a win-win situation. So the security and geopolitical risks are there. Now, assuming the conflict worsens, instability will worsen, insecurity will worsen. Indirectly, we would have extremist recruitment, maritime insecurity, cyber threats, and then the proxy wars or proxy competitions. So strategically important African waterways, which includes the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and the Suez-linked maritime corridor. All of these areas could experience increased militarization and shipping disruptions. So what should we do? What should a continent look out for in the context of positioning ourselves and looking at the engagement with global partners overall? We should focus on our economic resilience, which is very key. Because if you even look at all these countries we are talking about, directly affected and indirectly affected, some have been able to be resilient with regards to supply chains when it comes to oil and gas. And so as we are talking about 5 weeks or 4 weeks of storage, people are talking about 100 days, 7 months, and whatnot of storage. And that's the disparity and the difference. And that's why we need to look at our economic resilience. Then we should talk about continental integration. And I go back on the framework of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is a very important mechanism for reducing external threats or vulnerabilities, and which will strengthen our trade internally. We should also look at how we can strategically position our aspects or positioning our ideas or approaches when it comes to diplomacy. Maintaining diplomatic flexibility is key. As much as possible in this geopolitics and its uncertainties, avoiding binary alignments would be very, very strategic. Industrialization, which is tied to economic resilience, as I see it, would be a very top key aspect with regards to the value addition when we're talking about manufacturing, industrialization of petrochemicals, fertilizers production, renewable energies, and all of those key variables that is essential when you talk about industrialization. So in the end, I'd like to conclude on the basis that this is not merely a crisis in the Middle East or crisis that affects the main actors in there. The systemic global shock, which we are all feeling, has been or is a very key evidence for us to look at ways which for we as a continent, we can strategize when it comes to our resilience. It won't be conflict, it would be issues about health, as we had before when you talk about COVID-19. It could be any issue, natural disasters and whatnot. But in the long term, if this crisis persists, how do we also look at creating opportunities for the continent with regards to the resources that we have? Trading the resources with the basic needs that will satisfy our citizens, so we would be able to curb insecurities and political instability on the continent. I end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Dr. Doke. It was truly very insightful listening to you. I want to thank all of our distinguished speakers for their thoughtful and illuminating contributions. We would now like to quickly begin the question and answer segment of the forum. Participants who have not yet submitted their questions are encouraged to do so via the chat box. We'll begin taking selected questions. So we'll give the next 2 or 3 minutes to any questions that have to be typed in the box. In the meantime, for the few that have, I'm going to start directing to particular panelists. And the first will go to Professor David Shinn on the strategic drivers of the conflicts of this war. The question is, to what extent did the breakdown of the diplomatic frameworks surrounding Iran's nuclear program contribute to the escalation of the conflict? And could existing regional security mechanisms realistically have prevented this outcome?
Clearly, there has been so far no progress in resolving the future nuclear capability of Iran as a result of this conflict initiated by the United States and Israel. I think that is probably the single most important issue, in addition to opening the Strait of Hormuz, facing all of the players involved in this. And it seems to be high on the list for discussion, particularly between the United States and Iran in the days going forward. But it also seems to be the issue on which there is the least agreement, in that the United States has been pressing for effectively the elimination of any nuclear capability in Iran. And Iran argues that that's not acceptable because they want to have a capacity for civilian use of nuclear energy. And this is going to be a major sticking point. I don't know how the two sides get around it. Iran says that it is not going to produce a nuclear weapon, but I think the United States and others are skeptical of that assertion because Iran has not been totally honest in the past with what it will or will not do in the region and beyond. So I appreciate the skepticism, but it's a real problem now in terms of resolving. Clearly, the international community, those agencies that are involved in monitoring Iran's nuclear capability need to get re-engaged in it. I think that's probably the starting point. And we will see in the days ahead whether that happens. I may be pleasantly surprised, and there may be some progress in the coming days on this issue. But if there is not any progress, then it seems to me like this conflict continues to be a nasty problem that remains to be solved.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shinn. I have been informed that Professor Nelson will be taking over. So.
Yes, thanks, Aram, for holding forth, and also thanks to the distinguished speakers for the very insightful comments. So I just wanted to explore or kind of see how we can maybe solidify some of the themes that we are building, and also possibly explore new areas. And I wanted to follow up with Professor Shinn. So, I mean, this conflict, you can call it a war or whatever label you want to put on. When you listen to the American and the Israeli side, was a war that was grounded on a certain notion of nuclear non-proliferation. This idea that a nuclear-armed Iran is a threat to global security, and so there was the need for that level of action by the U.S. and the Israeli government. But then when you look at some of the impacts and the effects, it seems to really unsettle the global space for nuclear proliferation. I mean, countries such as North Korea would be looking on and would feel justified that it built its nuclear capabilities, in part because it's prevented the kind of thing that the Iranians have suffered. And so my key question is, where does this kind of broader ambition of nuclear non-proliferation, where does it stand as a result of the war in the Middle East? And I was wondering if you could reflect on that as part of the broader strategic realignments that we are seeing.
I'm not sure I have a great answer for that question. I would suggest that it really has to go back to those international agencies that are responsible for monitoring nuclear proliferation globally, including in Iran. And there obviously had been some progress in the past on that. There had been visits to Iran that would occasionally check on what their capacity was. And to the extent we know anything about the ability of Iran to produce a nuclear weapon today, it's largely as a result of those agencies. I think other than turning to the international agencies, I don't know where one goes. I don't personally, I don't accept an assurance from the government of Iran they will never do anything wrong. But at the same time, there has to be some method for reasonably assuring that the whole question of non-proliferation is moving in the right direction. And I really do lay that in the feet of the international organizations who have that responsibility.
No, thank you. And again, looking at the broader issue of realignments, one of the points that our other speakers, Dr. Pra and Dr. Doke also highlighted was the issue of energy. And so the follow-up I have is there's been this global effort for net zero. Of course, it took a long time, and even on the African side, there is deep hesitation to, especially countries like Nigeria, Ghana, to essentially forgo the strategic energy resources that they have. With this war, particularly if you look at some of the issues that are coming around jet fuel, and we know that jet fuel is governed by this general understanding that there should be no taxes on jet fuel. And a lot of the climate activists have argued that this treaty is antithetical to the spirit of net zero. And so there's been a lot of calls to remove tax exemptions, for instance, on fossil-based jet fuel. But also in Nigeria and other places, this whole discussion around subsidies to fossil has been a topical issue. And so with the challenges that we are receiving, there is a call for these subsidies to continue. And I think Dr. Pra actually made mention that governments are going to be forced at one point to provide subsidies and to essentially prolong these fossil-based technologies. So within that broader spirit of realignment, where do you think this war and its legacy would leave us in terms of Africa's positioning in net zero target? And I want to open that question for either Dr. Pra or Dr. Doke.
Do I go first? I think Africa quest for an alternative source of energy is paramount. However, being paramount alone, sorry, is not enough. There needs to be practical implementation on the ground. And it requires huge capital for such approach to alternative source of energy, like solar, windmill, and all these other alternative sources. But they are very expensive. And I think many African states, Prof. Nelson, you will bear with me, many African states do not have the capability to transition to these alternative sources of energy. And there's always been a call for more support from the major and advanced economies who emit much of these toxic gases into the atmosphere. But these kinds of support has not been forthcoming as it is to be expected. So it behoves on Africa to find alternative sources. However, the reality on the ground is many African countries are not in a position to afford. And until Africa is in the position to afford these alternative sources, the main focus on the current energy we have will be the major source. And for example, if you should ask Nigeria, a major oil producer, to transition from fossil fuel and all these to green source of energy, I'm not sure it will sit well with Nigeria and other oil producing economies in Africa, given the revenues they generate from this source of energy, unless they have being offered other sources of investment that will compensate for what they are getting from it. And also for normal Africans, ordinary African states who are not producers of even this fossil fuel, I think, for example, it's also in their interest to also transition, but they are not in the position currently. And to put it in a broader context, Africa's emission of these greenhouse gases is very low compared to these advanced economies, the US and China. And therefore, any effort for Africa to cut on it the burden should be borne by the advanced economies. And therefore, I think Africa is currently not in a position to, given financial constraints and the technological capability to do so. So I think until we are in that space of being more advanced in terms of economy, in terms of technology and financial capability, I don't see much change in Africa's position within this field at the moment.
Okay, Dr. Doke. Okay. I don't know if Prof. Olawale, if you want to, since Nigeria was invoked in Dr. Press' response, if you have any take on this.
Well, before making my contribution, let me call our attention to the logo of SPSP on this platform. You might be asking yourself, what is SPSP? SPSP is the Society for Peace Studies and Practice. It is based in Nigeria, but it has membership all over the world. And the goal of that society is to promote a synergic relationship between peace scholars and practitioners. So I am sure by the appearance of SPSP on this platform, many students of peace and conflict studies, most especially in Nigeria, are listening to this presentation. Now, thank you so much for raising the issue of energy. It's really very touching. Nigerians are worried that in a moment when they should be making money from oil, now they have to pay more for buying oil. And I think that is part of the governance question we are dealing with in the country. And I don't want to use this platform to wash our dirty linen. But basically, the issue of energy that is thrown up by the crisis in Iran is now global. For the first time, colleagues sent me videos of people queuing for oil, for fuel in Europe, Canada, and different parts of the world. And that tells us actually that it is not possible for us to dispense with the multilateral frameworks that we all agreed to for bringing peace to the world. And it tells us also that it is not possible for any one nation, no matter how big, to actually manage whatever conflict it's having with any member of the international community. And I think what we are experiencing now forces us to go back to the question on how to rebuild multilateralism. We all need it for making the world safer, for making all of us to be part of the modern human community. There's a need for us now to begin to discuss how, discuss the lessons of this, the lessons from Iran. And the lesson is that the world today is highly divided. The world today is experiencing the blowback of what is happening in Iran. We started with "it is their problem," because I've actually been following this conflict for many years, but I thought the problems in the Middle East as their problem, but now it is our problem. And I think that is the significance of what we're doing today. Once again, we really have to thank the Africa Governance Center by letting us know that the things happening thousands of kilometers away from Africa, of course, have one or two things to do with us here in Africa. Now, as I close, I know time is not on our side. I want to call attention to how Africa should respond to this problem. My colleagues said we should strengthen partnership across Africa. One of them called attention to the issue of economic integration of the continent. But I want to use this opportunity to actually also underscore the shame of Africans engaging in what one would call Afrophobia now. You know, we are saying we want to come together, but at the same time, we are rejecting ourselves. Across Africa, in South Africa, there is no need for me to pretend about it. Fellow Africans are being killed. They are being ejected from South Africa. Now, how do we build the African solidarity for managing our problems when we are not ready within the continent to tolerate ourselves? This is a question that this type of forum should also try to factor into our analysis. The world is breaking apart. You know, countries, the Gulf states, are discussing how to manage their problems. Now that Iran is attacking them, I am sure that Americans also are discussing how to manage their problems. In Europe, people are discussing what we are discussing here. The question is, what are the lessons for us as a continent? It is not a good story that it is at this time we are killing ourselves, sending ourselves, deriving ourselves from our respective African countries. This will not really help us. And I am looking forward to when Africa Governance Center, we actually call a meeting, just as we are doing today, to discuss Afrophobia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. And I think you, in this current response and in your opening remarks, you touched on an important theme in relation to the kind of intra-localized dynamics of this. And there's a question from Dr. Sherif from Tunisia. I don't know if you want to ask the question. The floor, we can open the floor for you, Dr. Sherif. Okay, I can read the question. So he says there is very little public popular support to Iran, apart from the few Shia protests in Nigeria that you mentioned. So how do you see this lack of interest, which seems to contradict all the talk about global South solidarity? That's the question.
Well, I think the problem basically is that when the Iranian Revolution was declared in 1979, Iran actually demonized itself by actually not creating platforms for good working relationship with other Middle East countries. I don't want to say Arab states, because when we go into the issue of which country is Arab or not, we'll be going into another area of analysis that may not be necessary here. For Iran to be able to enjoy the kind of image it's creating for itself, it must find good relationship with its neighbors. Unfortunately, that is not happening today. The relationship between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states, I think, are not the best. Even when you cross the Mediterranean, you come to Africa, I don't think Iran is doing enough to make itself attractive to all Middle East countries. So that is a problem. Now, for us in Nigeria is not an Arab state, and Nigeria is not part of the Middle East, but a strong evidence of Iran in Nigeria is the presence of a group called Islamic Movement of Nigeria, which we call Nigerian Shiites. Now, the point I try to make in my presentation is that as a result of the ongoing conflict in Iran, I think the Shiites in Nigeria are offended, and they've staged a number of protests. Now, the protests they staged as a result of the ongoing problem in Iran are warning signs to us of greater things that could happen, because this group have been having conflict with Nigeria since the 1980s, and many of its members have been killed. They have cases in court. Therefore, Nigerians feel that a sleeping problem has been woken up. We know what it means for us, for the shites to be on the streets. And I think security agencies in the country are working very hard on that. And then America came up with its own position on the matter to say it fears proxy attack. So this is an embassy that is sitting in Abuja now saying we have intelligence to the extent that we might be attacked, and as a result of that, the embassies I don't want to say the embassies has closed shop, but has downscaled its operations in Nigeria. That is not good for us, because when the embassy is not able to operate optimally, relationship between America and Nigeria is affected, trade is affected, diplomatic relationship is affected. School students who want to go to school in America are unable to get visa. And so what we're just trying to say is that the blowback on us is very, very heavy. The blowback on us is very, very heavy. And I'm sure there are several other countries that are going through other forms of problems as a result of this conflict. Now, the lesson for me is that in future, when the great powers are taking their decisions or they are getting involved in the kind of problems that we're witnessing in Iran, there's a need for them to also interact with smaller nations like Nigeria, because our interest too will be at stake. So it is not only the interest of America that is at stake. It is not only the interest of Israel that is at stake. The interest of all nations of the world are at stake. And I listened to a presentation a few days ago. A Nigerian worker said, as a result of the problem in Iran, that his pay could hardly buy fuel, give him fuel for going to work. So now this could have a ripple effect of people hating the government for not taking actions that are practically impossible. Yes, we buy fuel now from outside, and we buy at commercial rates, and those selling the fuel, we sell at commercial rates. So in other words, the problems in Iran could escalate the political conflict in Nigeria. We have too many of them already. It could actually send many, make many Nigerians to flee the country. Many Nigerians are actually engaging in irregular migrations as a result of the economic crisis in the land. So our hands are full in Nigeria as a result of problems we did not create. And I think this is the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. I will bring in Dr. Doke. There's a question that I think stems from your very insightful presentation from Millicent Atana. And Millicent is asking, while the war has introduced significant economic challenges, are there some sectors within African nations that can be strategically positioned to experience significant gains from the war?
All right. So with regards to the question and relating it to my presentation, I mentioned that possibly we can look at how we can use our commodities or resources in the midst of this crisis to gain some leverage when it comes to trade and the inflows of, funds. And yes, there are sectors on the continent, or if she wants to release sectors to individual states, very much so on the continent, where there can be a possible outcome or outlook when you talk about the crisis itself. What do we produce? The gold. And most of the gold producing companies have trade agreements with countries in the Middle East and most Arab nations. And so with this kind of war, the supply chain, yes, will be somewhat disrupted when you talk about the missiles that are flying and all of that. So you are not getting the quantum of gold or the minerals you should get and produce, and then your suppliers would also get. So then what becomes is the limited number of resources you have in there would become very scarce. And so if the embargo or the situation is addressed with regards to now, you can have planes leaving, cargoes leaving and bringing in goods, you already have a shortfall in the system. So what happens is that for we producing gold or whatever essential mineral it is, then we can now begin to renegotiate and strategize the aspect of engagement or agreements per what we produce and per what we should demand as payment. And because the commodity is in scarcity, it offers us the position to get what we want at that particular issue. And that's where we look at the aspect of sections or positioning or strategizing our positioning on the continent with regards to what we should gain from this particular crisis, what comes to us, in as much as the effects, the positives, what we produce, what we have with these countries. And that's what I look at from the question that she has asked.
Okay. No, thank you so much. And I think we can also take on the theme of the UN. Professor Olawale had talked about how essentially American unilateralism is essentially undermining the capacity of the UN to be proactive. And so I just wanted to bring in Professor Shinn as well as Dr. Doke here. What has this conflict taught us about the resilience of the AU as an institution? I think we've really highlighted the UN system. I know in the wake of the COVID period and all the challenges with supply chains and even the vaccine, the AU began talking about how to position itself for the next crisis or for the next pandemic. Of course, normally the best test to estimate the impact of your resilient structures is when there is crisis. And as we have highlighted, the war has really given us that moment. And so if there is anything we've learned about the AU security architecture or even the whole economic system that the AU is placed, what would you say that lesson has been? And Dr. Doke, you can take it, but I also wanted to hear the thoughts. So after your take, we get a thought of Professor Shinn.
Right. So in this particular issue, I am not sure the resilience is partly because of the existence of AU leadership or policy frameworks or whatever. I see the resilience as a whole on the part of all the proactiveness of individual states. More of the AU comes in probably looking at the aspect of issuing a statement with the very fine diplomatic language and all of that. But the individual states have been able to withstand the massive shocks with regards to policies that have come in. Although some countries are reeling from the effect, some countries have done well with regards to withstanding the shocks. So I think it's basically because of the measures individual states are putting in place. Holistically, if the AU should come into this, then I think we should look at how we can work out on the African Continental Free Trade Area What are the challenges? What are the shortfalls? What are the bureaucratic bottlenecks that is influencing the hibernation of this very important mechanism and framework? And by and large, when your economy grows as a continent or a geographical area, it reinforces what goes into your security and peace architecture. And so you are able to withstand whatever shocks that comes, to you. But if we are not able to do that as a regional body, then question marks, brought to bear. So then what can the AU do, aside issuing the statements where it will trickle down to individual, countries? The resilience will come in when the AU leads on that discussions with regards to how we can implement fully the continental free trade area and how we can trade within ourselves. And trading within yourselves would also mean that you're looking at the political instabilities, how to address them, the unconstitutional changes of governance and all of that. That would enable us to trade, because then how can we trade or have an resilient economic front if we have countries that are facing insecurities? You would expect that those countries filled with insecurities would now focus their resources on trying to stabilize, that area or the challenge that they have before they can even push those resources in a continental agreement such as a continental free trade area. So we need to look at all these things, and that's where the AU comes in, and that's what or how I can say it has been resilient with regards to pushing the individual states to be economically sound to be able to withstand the shocks.
Okay, thank you. Professor Shinn.
I certainly agree with Dr. Doke and his remarks on the AU. I think that to the extent that the African Union can use the events in Iran to underscore the importance and the necessity of implementing fully the African Free Trade Agreement, this is certainly an occasion to do that. Also, to the extent that it can encourage African countries to become more integrated across the board, I would recommend that too. There has not been a great deal of success so far in accomplishing that goal, but this may be an occasion where the African Union can use the example of the war in Iran to underscore the importance of both the African Free Trade Agreement and integration of African countries. I've followed events in the African Union for many years, and having lived in Addis Ababa for 3 years, was very closely associated with it during those years. And I must say, very frankly, I'm somewhat disappointed in what they have been able to accomplish in a number of cases. You look at the conflict in Sudan or in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it's their actions have just not been adequate. Actions of no one have been adequate, for that matter. But I expect more of the African Union, and it really has to step up. It has to be more assertive, more aggressive, and I think this is the time to do that.
Great, thank you very much. And we can build on with the other speakers. If you have any strategic recommendation, maybe one or two that you think, in light of these discussions, are very important to consider either at the regional level or at the country level, what would those recommendations be? Professor Olawale.
The recommendation for me is for us in Africa to recognize the present as the age of reglobalization. Reglobalization is to say that Africa must make new friends. In the past, it was easily possible for us to say our countries are aligned with certain parts of the world. But when we look at the politics that the different parts of the world are playing now, I think national interest is becoming better reinforced in articulating what each nation of the world is doing. So it will be foolhardy for us to keep thinking that there is a nation outside there that will help us. There's the need for us now to begin to think as Africans. What are the interests that we have to protect at national level, at continental level, at regional level? And how do we really protect this interest? So I think African Union needs to call a meeting where the members will look at themselves in the face and tell them the truth that we've been running away from for a very long time. We were in Accra 2 times to discuss ECOWAS member states. So I think this is a time when we really need to be honest with ourselves, to begin to reflect more critically on the mantra of African solutions to African problems. Other parts of the world are thinking critically on what they could do for themselves. Let's stop pretending that there is anybody outside there that will do what Africans are not willing to do for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the suggestion. So I will invite Dr. Pra to what would be the main strategic recommendation that you would recommend for the region in light of the war.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the war comes to one major conclusion: oil export or oil transition through the Hormuz constitutes about 20% of global oil, and this is where the problem is. So my recommendation is Africa as a continent and individual countries in Africa that produces oil should improve oil refining capabilities. I think this will help not only these individual countries, but the continent. And I'll give a very practical example. The current conflict has opened a very huge space for one businessman in Africa, Dangote, whose 650,000 barrels per day oil refining capacity is now the one supplying Ghana, supplying even South Africa, Cameroon, and other African countries, depending on a single individual. Now Nigeria sells crude oil to Dangote to refine in Naira, not in dollar. And therefore, it kind of gives the refinery some leverage to refine. So I think African states within the oil production should improve refining capability. Africa produces about 7% of global oil. However, most of them are sent outside for refinement and then brought back onto the continent at a higher price. So I think if this is implemented, it can reduce future shocks, which I believe this conflict will not end here. It will resurface in some years to come. And I think this can help us to prepare better in such dynamics. Thank you very much.
Great. And Dr. Doke, I was going to, because you've given us a lot in terms of recommendations, so if for your final recommendation, if you could focus on a particular group of countries that I think we haven't touched on much. We've talked about how this position oil exporting African countries, but for the non-oil exporters, what is coming from this conversation is some kind of a double whammy, where they would have to grapple with high cost of fuel imports, and also because the global strategic interest tends to align with oil-rich countries tend to be the most powerful anyway. And so it puts non-oil exporters in a kind of a unique position of vulnerability. So I was just wondering, what would your recommendation, especially for the group of African countries that are non-oil exporters, if you and Professor Shinn could give us your thoughts on that in terms of recommendation. Hello. Professor Shinn, you can take the floor. Yeah.
Okay, I thought it was addressed to someone else.
Yes.
That's a hard one. Clearly, as you say, non-African or non-oil exporters in Africa do face a double whammy. One, they're facing higher prices for importing petroleum, and particularly for refined products like aviation fuel, diesel fuel for buses and trucks. And they're also facing, in some cases, fuel shortages. So it's higher prices, it's shortages, it's just about everything that could go wrong has gone wrong with those countries. And even African oil exporters are facing a problem in terms of refined products. Even though they may export a lot of crude, many of them have to import aviation fuel and diesel fuel, et cetera, at higher prices. So they're sort of not getting much advantage out of it too. The solution to this is the hard part, and what will be interesting to see going forward is you have, for example, the United Arab Emirates that have said they're going to pull out of OPEC. I don't know whether that's going to have an impact upon other members of OPEC, whether this signals sort of the beginning of the end of OPEC. And if it does, then I'm not an expert upon the ramifications of that for non-oil exporting African countries, but it obviously would have an impact. Perhaps the upside to all of this for African countries is that those countries that were on the verge of exploiting oil resources, like Uganda, possibly Somalia, which where the Turks are very much involved in beginning exploration, Kenya to some extent. This is going to be an incentive for developing new hydrocarbon resources on the continent. So there may be a slight upside in that regard. But those countries that have no oil whatsoever and no prospect of discovering oil, at least in the near future, I see a rather dismal future ahead unless this problem and the Strait of Hormuz is resolved very quickly.
Thank you so much. Dr. Doke is with us. While you prepare for your response, there's a question that I will just throw in that is coming from Na Anyema. She says that Africa in the last decade has suffered from several systemic crises: COVID, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and now the Iran conflict. Speaking on economic resilience, can we narrow it and address how we can build contractual resilience to draw in foreign investment, which is one of the direct investment most African countries depend on for development? So essentially the issue of contractual resilience and capacity to be able to negotiate better contracts for the continent. So if you could tie that in with your response.
Right. First off, we should be able to ascertain our challenges with regards to, even having a simple mechanism for trade not working because of the political reasons. The other aspect is because we have different economical structures, or our economy is built on different, structural systems. Okay, you can even talk about the Anglo-Franco divide and how our economies are way much different. CFA versus the various currencies that we take or do transactions with. To have a contractual agreement, it will depend on what priorities we should focus on, because then we can't go looking into the big basket like that. We need to focus on what we need. what we should treat within ourselves before even looking at what can come in from our side or our relations or agreement with others. So if we should want to look at the aspect of contracts or renegotiate contracts or whatever with the outside or the institutions outside or countries outside, that we should look at our priorities areas also. What commodities bring in much revenue that we should focus on? And that would be one key area we should look at. And the other thing I would also look at is how, for we ourselves, do we always need to have the tangibles in return when we are talking about these contracts? What about the intangibles? What about the technology? Okay, technology to grow our industry, technology to grow the agri sector, technology to grow the energy sector. And these are key to our industrialization. So assuming we don't want any direct, foreign investment, but we want technology at its highest demand, then you could look at how we will be resilient, self-sufficient, and then be able to produce, manufacture on our own. Then we can look at how we become resilient as a continent. But if we are always looking at the aspect of contracts in terms of what we produce and what we get without looking at technology for development, then we would be in this situation for a very long time to come, because then any other shock would have the enormous effect it is having on us.
Thank you very much, and I think it's a good place to pause, noting that this conversation is going to continue. But I think as our inaugural forum, this has been extremely enlightening. While the world's attention has been on the choke point in the Gulf of the Strait of Hormuz, and for good reason, I think the panel has reflected on the impact, particularly Professor Shinn's less optimistic view about the impact that the chokehold currently is going to have, especially on non-oil exporters. It's a very important thing to look at, and it is within that broader spirit that I think we cannot overestimate the importance of this conflict or this war ending, and also the importance of a diplomatic solution, particularly given the urgency that it's required to address some of the impact that the war is having on countries across the region. I think that we've also highlighted different shifts that are happening across the continent, particularly and also around the world, as a result of the conflict as well. And what I am picking from, or what I've picked from the panel, is that this goes way beyond the economic sphere, and that it's important we take a more multidimensional or an intersectional look at this impact. Professor Olawale, for instance, talked about some of the internal tensions that are brewing in Nigeria, but also the where it leaves us in terms of the trust that African nations and African populations have in multilateral institutions, and this sense that the world is losing a very important strategic player in the shape of the United States in driving and upholding this multilateral system is a very important insight to note. I think Professor Pra also noted that it puts also governments in a very tricky situation where governments are being forced to draw on resources that would typically be earmarked for other strategic aspects of the economy to help cushion vulnerable populations about the impact of this war. And so we get a sense of a more overarching comprehensive impact on the region. But I think we've also ended on a very optimistic note in terms of pointing to strategic direction that the continent takes. And I think the theme of trade was a very important bit, where we think about the variety of resources that Africa has to offer, and to think about the ways in which we can leverage these resources to deal with the impact of the conflict. Also reflecting on some of the institutional shifts that have happened at the continental level, and the role that strategic partners and countries at the individual level are playing. I think that the war has given us a stress test of the strength of these institutions and some of the points that were raised. And I really like how we ended with Dr. Doke to think not only about the tangible impact or the tangible benefits, but to think about the long-term strategic intangible benefits in terms of technology transfer, and also building absorptive capacity and adaptive capacity that would really sustain these economies. I think are very much in line with some key discussions, particularly the UN SDGs emphasis on inclusive growth as well. And so I think from our end at the African Governance Center, it's been a very important discussion, and it actually signals the vision that we have to provide this forum as a place where we really position Africa within a global community, and also position the experiences of African societies and ordinary Africans within the various developments that occurs at a high level global strategic engagement. And so on that note, I would like to thank our speakers, Professor Shinn, Professor Pra, Professor Olawale, and Professor Doke for this very insightful presentation. I also want to thank our our participants for the very probing questions that you had, and also for listening and engaging with this panel. I am going to hand over to Ms. Benedicta, if you have any final words to share in terms of where we take this the forum forward. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Opon, and thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon and morning in the US. I think it's been a very insightful discussion. And as Elliot indicated, we're hoping to scale this conversation beyond the online platforms to having in-person forums in the coming years and coming months in different jurisdictions on the continent, but also beyond the continent. And so Professor Shinn expects us in the US, holding a forum in the US to discuss Africa's role and also the key indicators as well as the key predicaments that we are facing. And whilst doing that, also trying to forge alliances and partnerships that would drive our development as a continent. And so on behalf of the Africa Governance Center, I would like to thank you all for making time to join us, our panelists, our participants, as well as our moderators. From us here, we look forward to engaging with you again in the coming future. Thank you. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you so much. So I think we would say bye for now, but look forward to continuing the engagement. So I wish you all the best, and all the best to our dear continent, and also to the broader vision of a peaceful and prosperous global community.
Thank you for having us. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Mm.